I'm Lou Brown from Duke University's Forum for Scholars and Publics, and I want to welcome everyone today for our panel discussion, Latinx in the U.S. South, Futurities, Histories, and Practices of Unsettling. Thanks to our many co-sponsors at Duke for their support, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Franklin Humanities Institute, and the Departments of African and African American Studies, Cultural Anthropology, History, and Music. We're grateful to our wonderful panelists for putting together this program. I'm going to begin by introducing our moderator, Dr. Sarah Bruno, who will then take things over from there. Dr. Bruno is from the South Side of Chicago and graduated with her PhD in Cultural Anthropology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2021, where she was also a member of the First Wave Hip Hop and Urban Arts program. She is currently the ACLS Emerging Voices, Race and Digital Technologies postdoctoral fellow at the Franklin Humanities Institute and in the Department of Cultural Anthropology here at Duke. Her research and art lie at the intersections of performance, diaspora, and colonialism. She is invested in Puerto Rico, Blackness, femininity, and affect. Her scholarly and artistic work has been widely published. You can read more about her a little on our website, and you'll learn about her as she moderates this panel today. And now I'll turn it over to her. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to start introducing the panelists before I get into the questions. I see people are still entering the link. So I'm going to start first with Dr. Sophia Enriquez, a scholar and educator working at the intersections of Latinx and Appalachian cultures. She works as an assistant professor of music at Duke University, where she also teaches in the program for Latinx studies in the Global South. She earned her PhD in ethnomusicology at Ohio State University, where she was studying interdisciplinary music across Latinx studies, Appalachian studies. She's been involved in a number of public folklore projects across the Appalachian region. She's passionate about community-engaged scholarship. As a teacher, Sophia encourages students to explore their local communities. And her teaching praxis is informed by international feminisms. She's a practitioner of American folk musics and has performed with groups such as the Good Time Girls, a female folk trio in Columbus, Ohio, and the Lua Project, a Mexican Appalachian fusion band out of Charlottesville, Virginia. She plays music, y'all. Look at the instruments behind her. Love that aesthetic. Thank you. The next panelist we're going to go to is going to be Javier Wallace, the master storyteller. He is the race and sport postdoctoral associate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University. He completed his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. His research revolves around race, class, gender, labor migration, nationality, and transnationalism of athletes from the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean. His first book project, Sueños del Norte, Black Panamanian Hoop Dreams, and the Realities of Basketball Trafficking, was selected as a top topic on Afro-Latin Studies. For the Master Clark Dissertation Workshop, at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, he has his CV present and accounted for. He is of US and Panamanian heritage and has served as the athletic director and physical educator of the Republic of Panama. Javier is also the founder of Black Austin Tours. Additionally, he's the co-founder of Afro-Latinx Travel and Black Backpackers or Black Packers. He does everything, y'all. The next panelist I'm going to introduce is Javier Wallace, coming out of UNC Chapel Hill. Okay. Trying to find, there it is. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Health Behavior at the UNC Chapel Hill Gillings School of global public health. Her research is focused on examining the effects of structural and psychosocial stressors on type 2 diabetes prevention and management among US Latinxs and in Latin America. Further, she uses an intersectionality framework to examine risk factors, coping behaviors, and health outcomes, particularly among Latinx and Latin Americans of African descent in an aim to further unpack health inequities within those populations. She earned her PhD in health behavior from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then, last but not least, we have Cecilia Márquez. I envisioned a roar at that moment, like, she is the Hunt Family Assistant Professor in History at Duke University. Her research focuses on the history of Latinx in the US South from 1940 to the present. Dr. Márquez writes and teaches about the formation of Latinx identity, Latinx social movements, and the importance of region in shaping Latinx identity. She also enjoys reality TV. So I'm going to speak a little bit about how I ended up being the moderator of the panel. As it was stated, I'm the ACLS postdoc for the year out of the Franklin Humanities Institute, as well in cultural anthropology. I'm working a lot on Black Latinx folks, specifically Black Puerto Rican women, and I study music, dance, emotions, and I'm into the digital humanities. So when I was approached about this panel, I knew my range and I knew that I did not study Latinos in the US South, but I knew these people could get us to the questions and discussions that we wanted to hear. So hopefully the questions I came up with and that they came up with for each other can get us to thinking and being more invested about these particular conversations. I'm sure, as you saw in the invite on the flyer on the website, this panel is going to urge, surrounding campuses and hopefully this one, and by this one I mean Duke, to reinvest in regional histories, right, that are providing the structure for understanding the US South as we know it today. We'll also consider the histories of anti-Blackness, precarity, labor, and assimilation that have brought and continue to bring various groups of Latinxs to the South, right? So starting off with my questions, getting into this. I wonder how is the narrative of migration useful or hindering understandings towards the groups of people you work with and are invested in, right? That's where we're going to start. Who would like to take it away? Yes. Don't all come at me at once.
I'm happy to start. I'll jump right in. I first just want to say how grateful I am for everyone here who's attending and for my co-panelists. It feels like such a special time to be in the triangle with people from so many disciplines really thinking about these questions in really critical and interesting ways. And I think even just trying to sort of come together and think about, what are the questions that we have in common and what are the kind of themes that we share demonstrates to me all of the exciting tensions that are kind of underneath this category of Latinx and what it means to talk about Latinos in the US South. So I will start by sort of, I'm a historian. And so to me, what I'm interested in sort of the long history of Latinos in the US South, and long meaning 1945. There's other historians who would tell you that that's journalism, because it's not, we haven't gone back to the Civil War. But so I'm interested in the much longer history of Latinos in the US South. And so to me, part of the reason I find migration an interesting, but often sort of overemphasized part of the Latino story, especially when we're thinking about Latinos in the US South. For a lot of the populations that I'm looking at, there have been sort of long-standing community, as long as the 1970s. So when we're talking about some of the communities that are here in the South right now, these are second, third, fourth generation Southerners. And so I think part of what we have to also start talking about is the way that that migration and Latino-ness get sort of over determined on each other. The words aren't exactly landing right now, but that the way that they're sort of over connected, right? That there's actually longstanding Latino communities in this region who are Southerners, who have every kind of claim to this region, every kind of claim to the South, and that we need to start accounting for the ways in which those Latino Southerners are invested in all of the things in the South, good and bad, right? And how we are a part of this region for better and worse. And so I think that focusing always on Latinos as newcomers really hinders us from being able to think about the ways that Latinos have been building the South.
Yes, I think I can continue off of that. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Sarah. And thank y'all, everybody who's attending here. I think the best way that I can really approach that question when thinking about migration is to use myself as the principal point to think about, and not saying that everybody's experiences are like mine, but I really come to use myself as a point of inquiry in like who I am and how do I end up being Javier Wallace, this big Black man from Austin, Texas, like, you seeing right now virtually, like, how does this come to be? And many people would think that for me, migration to the U.S. South, it starts with my father. I mean, by the way, Deshira and I are cousins, if y'all last think about the Wallace. And this plays into the story too. Our grandfathers are brothers. We did not know each other growing up. We met via Twitter and all those good things. But my father and Deshira's father actually entered around the same time to Austin, Texas, to a historically Black college and university, Houston-Tillotson College, now it's Houston-Tillotson University, HT, on athletic scholarships from the Republic of Panama, coming primarily from the U.S. Panama Canal Zone of Black people of West Indian descent, which that history deserves its own type of reckoning with, like, what does it even mean to be Latinx? What does it mean be from Latin America? But these Black people, my dad and his siblings and other family members and other people that are entering into Austin, Texas in 1970s, that are coming along in this migratory period of other Black Panamanians, mostly of West Indian descent. And when I say West Indians, I mean people that have a relationship with the British Caribbean and migrated to Panama and the Central American Isthmus to work on these North American and European projects, but namely the Panama Canal. And what did that experience look like there? And then now coming to the United States in the South, in a place that's racially segregated. I mean, they're coming in the 1970s and not fitting within this idea of Latin American at all, because it doesn't work. In my father's case, it didn't work for him coming from Panama. And it definitely did not work for him being in Austin, Texas in the 1970s. But and I think a larger migration, and I'll make this one brief, is my family on my mother's side, who is an air quote African-American, talking about migration. And like Cecilia mentioned, a longstanding migration, maybe the 1940s, is journalism, because I'm gonna take it back, before the Civil War, but understanding that also my family on my mother's side, I think we have a longer entanglement with Latinidad, because being from Texas, I'm understanding, reading the records of people who enslaved us, that my family was trafficked from the neighboring United States in the 1820s and the 1830s into Mexican Texas to perform enslaved labor in these Anglo colonies that the Spanish government and the Mexican government allowed to be there. And I think about race-based enslavement being a part of that. So migration, also thinking about Black people being forced into migration into this Latin territory. And what has that relationship been for us in this space where, the people who can claim Latinidad without any problem have always, before the US, they didn't need the US to make them think about whiteness or being white. But then also when the US made certain things, they were able to claim whiteness, and their relationship to us as Black people in the South has not always been pretty. There has been very strict things that they have said about not wanting to be in community with Black people, period, at all. And our laws have actually reflected that. So when I think about migration, in some in the US South, I think there's one to be reckoned with now when we think about what does this look like now, but also reckon with that this migration has also gone in other directions and put us in history, put us within history of larger historical migrations of forced enslavement that continue to impact us to this day. Now, be quiet on that one.
Well, before I get into the next question, you know, Javier, Cecilia had proposed a great question for you that you started to answer, but I want to go back for a second, because is migration an appropriate frame when discussing human trafficking, right? Like, does migration suggest a level of consent and willingness that is not necessarily present in the lives of many of those in the US? So what language would serve us best in capturing those diverse experiences of these people in motion?
Okay, I'm gonna try to be very brief because I know everybody else wants to say some amazing things. And I know that question was directed to me on my work about human trafficking in high school basketball or basketball trafficking in relation to migration. And I think trafficking, to be quite honest, in the work that I do, is the best language to use for that phenomenon, because I want people to think exactly what comes to your mind about trafficking. And I want you to, I want to know if that image that comes to your mind are Black men, Black boy basketball players. Like, is that something that comes to your mind when you think about trafficking? So I want us to challenge the idea, what does it mean to be a victim of being exploited, and primarily through sport, and open that up to give space to these people, young people who have been victimized in ways that they have not been seen or read legible because of who they are in the world. And I cannot disconnect that from what I said historically about forced migrations of Black people into these spaces, and then also connecting that to my father and air quote voluntary post enslavement migrations. And what does that mean to have to move to another space to access a life that the nation that either wants you or does not want you cannot provide for you in that place? So what does that look like then? And I'll leave that alone, but I'll continue to use trafficking in the context of sport and as I use it. And also when I talk about enslavement, I use trafficking. Those are my languages, but I'll defer to everybody else.
I could bring up something on the public health side of things, in that I do agree that language needs to be very clear, because you're right, migration makes it sound like there is a consent process. Everyone has a similar process, which is not true. I do think it's important to think about the history of migration, even if it's been 2-3 generations, because how you got here, the policies in place that were constructed for you to get here either allowed you benefits or cause structural barriers to get the things that you needed. So a lot of this depended on where you migrated from, what you migrated to do, and they're also constructed as a racist and discriminatory policy. And so the ability to get resources impacts your ability to get different jobs, get access to social services, get educational, be able to get educational attainment in different ways, depending on the state that you ended up landing in. And also that impacts health. And so the work I do on the psychosocial piece and that structural piece, it's all that stress gets embodied somewhere, right? And it shows up in different ways. It causes lack of sleep, causes, the differences in type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular outcomes, migraines, all those different things get embodied. And a lot of that is reflective of whether or not you actually were able to get access to benefits or not. And I'm talking about this in a much more contemporary way. However, I like to go back. I wish I did some more history and I was more of a history major, and link history. So some of the work I did in my dissertation, an entire chapter on history, on different countries and different regions of Latin America, and how that causes differences in people who are quote unquote Latinx in the United States to be able to get services. And that's why we see some of these disparities, because some of people were considered refugees Others were not, even though they had claimed to become refugees, right? And so all those things were very racialized too. And so those are things that are really important to consider as well.
I would love to ask a follow-up question about that, Deshira, because this is something, I mean, this is one of the questions I posed to you in our sort of pre-discussion, but, you know, a lot of the work that I do is trying to think about, you know, troubling this category of Latinx, you know, what it does and doesn't hold, what is and isn't helpful about it. And to me, what's really interesting about the sort of public health side about that is how these categories become really meaningful, right? When you're doing these kinds of large data sets, you know, trying to understand how populations are, to use your sort of language, are or are not able to access certain kinds of resources, right? So how you are categorized becomes really meaningful in terms of what kinds of resources we can fight for. And so I'm curious to just hear how you're thinking about that, and how you think about this category of Latinx, especially because you're looking at populations here in the South, and you know, in this kind of discussion about Blackness, Latinidad, Black Latinidad, how are you sort of working through that in your own research?
Really good question. So you're right that Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, however it's been constructed since like the 70s, it's been used in public health as a useful category in a broad sense, but you're right, it doesn't get at any of the nuances of what happens within that group. And so the whole reason I went into public health in the first place was because I wanted to critically unpack who these quote unquote Latinx, Latinos were in the studies that I was reading. They were recruited and I was like, okay, but this experience doesn't quite fit the experiences that I know from other people. And also they differed by, they're talking about geographies. A lot of the early public health research is coming from the Southwest, California, and New York. Okay, cool. That's not really reflective of what I need here in North Carolina. And so most of the time Latinx is undefined. It makes this assumption that the experiences of Latinx people in somewhere USA is generalizable to all people who may fall under this umbrella, but that's not the case. And so we have to be clear about who's involved in the studies and honor their experiences in order to make sure that we're not following and perpetuating one stereotypes. We're ensuring that we actually make programs and interventions that actually help the people we're purporting to help. I have a great example that I did an interview with a man from Peru in North Carolina, moved to North Carolina from Peru, who's older. He had prediabetes. His doctor told him to go talk to a nutritional counselor. He goes to talk to the woman. She sees in his chart Latino. She makes the assumptions that he eats tortillas. And he talks to me, he's like, that is not my diet. I do not eat tortillas. I eat potatoes, I eat bread, but she didn't bother to ask. She didn't bother to figure out my background and my experiences. And so he was like, that was a waste of my time, right? And so we're not distinguishing what that means. And I've had people ask me, why do I care about distinguishing and really centering these unique, different experiences and not making it undefined Latinx, making an undefined Latinx group, especially if they find interventions that work for their undefined Latinx group, right? And I thought it's obvious, different groups have different experiences. My experiences are different than different people on this panel because of different intersectional, the way I navigate the world is just going to be very different. And so I wish I responded at the time when some people were asking me like, why does this work matter? And I wanted to be like, how do you know that your work is actually successful for all the Latinx people that you claim it is? How do you know that it could not be improved upon? How do you know you're not systematically excluding some of the most marginalized people within the Latinx group? So in my work, I focus, as Dr. Bruno mentioned, on Black people from Latin American heritage, so Black Latinx people, because more often than not, public health studies completely ignore them. I spent the better part of the last 5 years finding an appropriate data set to actually do the work I want to do. It does not exist. I mean, they're great people like Dr. Luisa Burrell, Dr. Adolfo Cuevas, who have published work on Black Latinx health using national data sets, but out of thousands of Latinx people, only 500 qualify or self-identify as Black Latinx amongst like 10,000. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so the data is limited, the data is bad. So instead, I will have to construct it myself and construct it in a way that where I center Black Latinx people, also ensure I center include Indigenous Latinx people. Those are different experiences. And we just never in public health and population science have enough numbers to differentiate and to really understand their experiences and to make sure that our programs, I mean, we're in COVID right now. We always get these reports about like Latinos, Black people, and then it's always like in New York. And I'm like, but there are some people who fall in between, right? And I don't see the numbers of the people who fall in between or have these dual experiences and dual identities. And so I'm always just like, I just don't know who you're talking to me about. And that's like my perpetual question when I work in public health. So yeah, it's an issue, but that's a good question. Thank you.
So moving into the next question, and Sophia, this next question, you could kick it off, right? I'm thinking through, how is white supremacy quiet in the work you do? And how is it loud? Are there any specific places where you hear it most? And I'm starting off with Sophia because, I believe someone left this question for her. So like when people are thinking of the Appalachian region, right, they're thinking primarily of these white communities. And I think it's really fascinating the work you do, right? So I'm going to let you talk about that.
Thank you, Sarah, and everyone else. I've already learned so much from this discussion. So the first sort of preliminary framework of the question about, I love the language about how white supremacy might be quiet or loud. As an ethnomusicologist and someone generally interested in creative expression and sound, and how some of these racial politics and dynamics that we've already sort of been hashing out, how they sound and how people encounter them in sort of everyday artistic practice. And this also, the interest and just the importance of highlighting the impact of creative expression as part of the everyday sort of lived experience, but also a story of migration. It's also in the same way that sort of Cecilia was articulating the way that the sort of trope of the Latino newcomer in the South is sort of replayed. It's also that migration of labor sort of takes on the primary narrative, which is true in so many ways, but there's also migrations of tradition, right, of food, of music, of dance, and that migration plays a really crucial role to how folks sort of create community and feel sense of belonging and sort of cultivate new spaces and reinvent traditions as well. So I'm sort of coming at it from the lens of being someone generally interested in like how the everyday creative expressions of people manifest in these different ways. And in the case of Appalachia, I also enter into this conversation sort of a little different in that my regional focus is on Appalachia, which, not to insult anyone's intelligence, but just sort of for clarity's sake, right? The mountainous region that stretches up from parts of Maine all the way down into northern Georgia, and which has been sort of a subfield of study, of regional study among folks, and that the field of Appalachian studies really was born out of this intersection among academics, artists, and activists in the 1970s who were looking for ways to better sort of interrogate and understand this region, which, as many of us are familiar with, has sort of been defined as a white, backward, impoverished, right, monolith, and that image of like the poor rural white folk of Appalachia is sort of what like Appalachia's main export, among other things, among it being a very sort of resourcefully rich region with things like oil and coal. So through the lens of the sort of dominating, totalizing sort of whiteness that comes out, that narrative that comes out of Appalachia, that's where it's loudest. Right, I would say it's just the general sort of stereotype that circulates, and the harm and the violence that stereotype continues to produce. And that, of course, there's lots of folks within Appalachian Studies and other places who are actively working against that. And just to wrap it up here, a musical example would be and sort of a point of interest for me, and that got me interested in looking at the intersection of Latinx and Appalachian music traditions in particular, is the way that the sort of image of the banjo and that the sound of the banjo as this like very backward hillbilly instrument. And I use that word in its sort of intellectual life, not in the derogatory sense, right? That has actually done a lot of harm in erasing the Black heritage of the banjo as an instrument of the African diaspora, right? And so that's a whole other side thing. But so there's also like, there's the sonic and musical dimensions of how white supremacy sounds in Appalachia, which is one that has long erased the cultural and musical contributions specifically of Black and Latino folks in that region.
Oh, no, I kind of want to add and ask a question geared to Sophia and Cecilia. Because I mean, I know Sophia and I, we all had a conversation before this, and Sophia did a lot of explaining on the work that she does and how it relates to music as well, and like the historical placement of that music and migration of people who either would identify as Latino, Latina, Latinx, or who have been ascribed or subscribed that category to them. And it also makes me think about the what Cecilia does from the 1940s, an amazing article that I read about Juan Crow in the United States that she produced. It really, I'm thinking about within Latinidad, and particularly within Latinos, Latinas, Latinx people in the US South, where is white supremacy in the way they've interacted with the populations in the South, specifically with Black people, specifically in a place where race-based enslavement was law, was social practice, was custom, and then also into a place where de jure racism, Jim Crow, was also on the books, and having to decide whether they fall on that spectrum. Where is that at historically and contemporary in the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I mean, I'll start. That's such a helpful question. And in some ways, really the first, and so I'm looking from sort of 1940s to the present. And part of what I look at is how race changes over that period. So the way that we think about Latinos in the South today is actually a pretty new invention. And so what happens is when I look at Latinos in the Jim Crow period, especially when we're looking at non-Black Latinos in the Jim Crow period, the way they're identifying themselves in general, when they're sort of like faced with this question of like, which door do I use, right? Because part of the reason Jim Crow is such an interesting time period to look at is that people are being forced to make really explicit racial choices all the time. And when they are faced with those doors, they're often saying, I'm not Black, so of course I chose the white entrance, right? This is a sort of a phrase that I hear coming over and over again. When they talk about, I left San Antonio and I came to the US South and I was in Mississippi and I was trying to pick the door. Of course I chose the white door, I'm not Black, right? And so part of the argument that I'm making in the book is that non-Black Latinos are identified within their relationship to Blackness, right? If you are Black, if you are a Black Latino, then you were Jim Crowed. And if you are a non-Black Latino, you were able to access white accommodations. And so part of the argument, there's all of this emphasis, I think, on sort of thinking beyond the Black-white binary. And in some ways, what my work shows is that that binary holds a lot of diversity, that it can actually hold a ton of racial complexity, that it's basically able to say, if you are not Black, we are going to make a space for you in whiteness in this time period, because the main goal of Jim Crow is to control and police Blackness. And so non-Black Latinos of varying sort of color, class, position, et cetera, were able to find a space within whiteness in this time period. So white supremacy is incredibly loud in the story. The story is basically white people, white institutions and white people being faced with a sort of a racially ambiguous population, being sort of asked like, all right, what are your priorities here? Like, make a choice. And over they choose white supremacy and anti-Blackness, right? And being willing to incorporate a certain amount of racial difference with non-Black Latinos as a way to reaffirm over and over their commitment to anti-Black racism.
Yeah, and so I guess that where I map onto that question, I mean, is first that my family sort of history is both mixed with like white settler folks in Appalachia and also Mexican folks who moved to the Mississippi Delta in the 1920s to work as sharecroppers, and were fitting into exactly the historical moment and context that Cecilia is sharing with us, and that writes and teaches about, and that we're actively participating in that dynamic of anti-Blackness, and that we're sort of just participating in those dynamics. But I mean, we also see this in, for example, like the way that these popular music traditions that are also linked to this very sort of transformative legislative moment and historical moment in terms of migration legislation, like the 1920s through the 1940s, in terms of the way that a sort of, and I work a lot with a lot of Mexican folk music traditions, right? So the sort of moment when a national Mexican folk music agenda is coming to the fore at the same time that a sort of like US-based country music is coming out of places like East Tennessee and Western Virginia, and that are also, aligning as closely as possible and sort of exporting again those images of whiteness that are, that hinge on anti-Blackness. And so it's very present too in the politics of the music industry and its sort of formative moment in that same period that Cecilia's work is talking about.
I guess my question is white supremacy ever not loud in the work that we do? Like even the silent, quiet parts are super loud. Even in thinking about just social sciences, public health, the types of work that are considered legitimate are often biased towards quantitative research versus qualitative. So a lot of people here, we do qualitative research, we're interested in narratives and stories and archives. Maybe that's not considered as legitimized, or the leaders or the people who developed social statistics. They'll be like, you're thinking about proportions, you're thinking about all the regression. All of that were developed by eugenicists. You have Francis Galton, you have Carl Pearson, like all these people, like the construction of it, the developers were eugenicists. The goal was for them to determine the population why white people were better than primarily Black people, and then just also non-whites in general, and also legitimizing it through statistics. And then we have a question, we probably could talk about the US Census, but the US Census legitimized that again, too. The construction, I think Francis Walker, who was a superintendent of the US Census from the 1870s to the 1890s, used the racist ideas of African inferiority in the United States based on him. He used the census data to say, well, people of African descent, they're lowering in population. There's fewer of them than there were 10 years ago. That indicates that they cannot survive, or they have limited ability to survive, unless they were enslaved again. Like he used the census data to legitimize these things. And that was fine. These are people in government. These are like the fathers of social statistics. And we see it again. In public health, there's a lot on right now. Genetics just keeps coming back up again, of finding inequities through genetics, through differences. And then what makes this interesting for the Latinx people is Latin America, or the Americas, is a particularly hot place for the geneticists to work because of the violent history of quote unquote miscegenation. Although they don't call it violent, they just are like admixture. And a lot of that is coming from Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, some out of the United States, and trying to understand how many African quote unquote alleles lead to this type of inequity, or indigenous alleles lead to this type of inequity compared to white or Caucasoid. So I'm doing a study right now looking at all this. These are things that are coming out 2019. Like, it's just a consistent thing that has not changed. And so it's not quiet. I mean, it's so quiet that it's always loud. And I think it's kind of like, you know, like a white noise machine. Like, it's just always there, that you kind of have to like make sure to remember to listen to it, because it's just there in how we construct our questions, the types of analyses, methodologies we use, and making sure that we're very cognizant of that too.
I loved I think that what you just said was so helpful about sort of, I'm also really interested in this like volume metaphor that we're seeming to extend, and I'm kind of into right now. But it's also about who's listening, right? Like, white supremacy is always loud from certain positionalities, right? And so, I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in the 1990s, one of the moments that I look at is when large numbers of Mexican migrants come to Georgia, specifically is where I'm looking. And all of these white sort of leaders in industry talk about how hardworking Mexicans are, right? That these are hardworking, industrious, good family value people, right? And so this is a moment that we could look at and say, oh, white supremacy is sort of turned down. But for Black communities, no one ever heard the volume turned down, right? Everyone knows that calling Mexican and Mexican American workers hardworking is a way to discredit, distance, disenfranchise, fire, unemploy Black workers, right? So I think this idea of from what position are you listening, the volume of white supremacy changes. It's just, I found that really sort of compelling to think about, this idea of volume.
Thank you. So I'm going to go into this like last question, and then we'll get into the question in the Q&A module. So if you have questions, make sure you're typing them in the chat so that we can start answering them. But to wrap up like my questions that I had for y'all at the top of this, right? I want us to think about, how is the future a map of where we must go and where we must avoid, right? So by that, I mean, what policies are hindering the future we can envision, right? Like, what are the limits on this future that we're imagining, the map we're making right now in the moment? And also, like, Deshira, you were just talking about censuses. So like, how can those be reimagined as well, right? So. Thank you.
Go ahead, Deshira. Go ahead.
Oh, I mean, for me, the census is just always an interesting question. My question for the census question is, what is the census supposed to do? Like, is it supposed to just count people? Because you could count people and not ask them anything about race, ethnicity, nothing. But like, why is it so important to capture that? And also, like, how is that data used? Often not for good reasons. It's for like construction of citizenship, who has access to property. Now it's redistricting zones. So like, but the reason the census is such an important thing to think about is how the census questions are constructed are then used in other large scale data sets, or even small ones. You don't even have to go that big, like small public health ones will just be like, well, we use the census ones. And I'm like, but they aren't great. And so I spent a lot of time being like, this is not good. You can ask more than one question. Someone I think is asking a question like, what would I think about for the construction of, especially with thinking about Latinx with different multiple identities. That's my next study. That's what I'm working on. I'm constructing thinking about this beyond phenotype and even beyond self-identity. Nancy Lopez has a question that's called street race. What do other people think you are, right? It's not just about what you consider yourself to be, it's how other people are interacting with you. That is also what leads into discrimination, access to resources, things like that. Even things like jobs become racialized. Like when people think of farm workers, they're thinking about particular groups of people. Even the term immigrants in the United States, every time I hear the term immigrants, they really are thinking about people from Latin America and the Caribbean, not all the immigrants coming from other parts of the world. Like words become racialized too. So it's a multi-dimensional aspect. And I want to understand what parts of those dimensions really are important for people's ability to navigate and also for their health. So you can ask a self-identifying question. That's what the census is for. But I think you need to ask things a little bit more beyond what do you think you are? Because as Charles Mills says, the question of what race are you is more like, where do you put yourself in the social hierarchy within the context of where you live? And which comes back to Cecilia's question of which door did you pick, right? So if I don't want to be, because I already know what Blackness means, I already know what they don't have access to, why would I put Black down, right? If I want self-preservation, as my mother says, you know? And so I'm trying to think about things beyond self-identity when thinking about things on the population scale.
There we go. Amazing response. I think, where do we go from here? If I'm being honest, I'm being myself, which I try to be every day. I'm afraid, to be quite honest with you. I'm definitely afraid of where we're going, and particularly where Latinidad is going within the United States. I'm definitely afraid when Latino or Latina, Latinx becomes an official racial category on the census. I think of all of the implications that it's going to have, and what Deshira just mentioned on Black people, somebody who does not fit comfortably, whatever that word is, within this definition. And I think we have history to look at to show how these things have worked themselves out. Tanya Hernandez, I think it's at Fordham, it does an amazing job when thinking about the legal ramifications of when Latino becomes an official racial category in the United States, and what does that mean? And you know, this is always a particular interest for me because I'm from the state of Texas. And you know, now we understand that Texas, like one of the largest ethnic groups, if you will, in the state are people who are identified as Hispanic. And there's this idea of this takeover, or this reconquest of Texas. And that scares me because, as I mentioned at the beginning, our introduction to Texas was not anything beautiful. So what does that mean to have these new this category that's been here and fashioned in a certain way to be reintroduced? And that's scary to me, because the way that I've seen it play out in my everyday lives in ways that I'll never have been read legible within this demographic. I don't say community because that would seem that we're in community with each other. In many ways, I don't feel like I am. I mean, and I take it to the basic level when I go into a store and the person at the store is talking to everybody in line in Spanish and greeting them in Spanish. But when they get to me, they struggle to say hello in English. What is it about me that made you do that? But I know that's a very simple moment that I just addressed, but I think the simple moments, that moment that it took to make that decision, that assumption that went into that decision, in many ways is demonstrative of how those play out in our everyday lives and interactions. So I'm scared, to be quite honest with you. And I mean that both in the United States and the impacts that it has in the countries where, quote unquote, people from Latin America come from. Because there's no cakewalk there either. So I don't know what the future is. Obviously I don't sound too optimistic about it, but those are my realities. I don't know.
I mean, I can add a little bit. I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is about the census. And as someone who studies the historical census is like a guy in a clipboard. It's like a random guy. I mean, which is why I think that story that you're telling, Javier, about the sort of interaction at a store, those little moments are, I mean, as a historian, like those are really significant and important in the way that we make race and make meaning out of race. Those are the moments that it happens. And so the census, you know, in the 1940s is a guy in a clipboard walking up to people and being like, so like what's going on? Tell me about yourself. And what's really interesting is when you look at the census, people are making all kinds of renegade decisions. You know, they'll put Nicaraguan under race. That is not a legally defined race at any point in American history. They will put Puerto Rican, they will put dark, they will put Black, they will put white, they will put, I mean, everything aside from like a doodle, you know what I mean? They just really will make some interesting choices. And so I think the historical census, in some ways, the kind of uniformity that we've started to see, I think part of what both, I think Deshira's earlier answer about the limits of those categories and Javier's current answer about the sort of I think appropriate pessimism about the future of Latinidad, that the kind of increased coalescence and coherence and to the extent that we start to create Latino as this like really firm category, I think it only serves to police who is in and out of that in a way that will almost certainly, and I think contemporarily, follow the traditions of Latin America and Latinos in the US and be anti-Black, right? I think that we have to I think to me, a future of Latino-ness that could be, a future of Latino-ness requires a transnational understanding of how race and white supremacy work, right? So understanding that people don't show up in the United States without ideas about race, that they're not entering into the United States without understandings about anti-Blackness, and that they don't show up and become a person of color without, you know, and I sort of use person of color in air quotes, right? Because that's anyway, a category that is its own construction that we could do a whole panel on, right? About what it means to be a person of color. Anyway, so that people don't show up without deeply held ideas about race, about whiteness, Blackness, indigeneity, and their own sort of position in that. So people are leaving countries of origin, coming to the United States with all of those ideas, and then entering into entering into the United States' ideas about race, and all of those collisions create complication. But what isn't complicated and what stays the same is the volume of white supremacy and the volume of anti-Blackness. And so if we can really hold that is a consistent thread, I think we have to reckon with that. And I think there is a reckoning hopefully happening within Latinidad. And I also think, like, you know, as someone who gets, you know, I get a paycheck now from history. I used to say this when I was in a Latino studies position. I'm like, I get a paycheck every month with Latino studies in it. So that isn't entirely true now, but like, I think Latino could go away and I think we would be just fine. I think we would all be just fine. And we could have really complicated discussions about our positions in the world, our relationships to race, our relationships to power. And we could all like that wouldn't be, I mean, happy Latino Heritage Month, everyone, as I say this. But I think we could, I feel sort of, as someone who's now given like 3 interviews this month about Latino versus Latinx, I think we could let go of the grip of it a little bit. I think we would all be better off for it.
So Sophia, if you have anything you want to add on.
No, I think Cecilia, that's a great place to pivot, and especially just as we are also working in this conversation in the context or the prevalence of the significance of place in making race, right? And this idea, I liked Sarah's language at the beginning of like what it means to reinvest in the specificity of regional histories, make those more legible and more visible, because they hold all of this messiness and this nuance that is so often missing from the conversations. So I think it's a good pivot point to some of our chat questions.
Yes, and so I'm going to start looking through some of them. Sorry, Chulo is barking. Some folks are asking for readings or maybe like books. So maybe in your answers, we can do some gesturing towards work. Okay, so is it possible, I'm gonna try to group some together, okay, bear with me. Is it possible for Latinidad to divest from its anti-Blackness? That is one. My question is how to have further conversations about these issues. And then are there differences or different approaches we can be taking, this is a different one, to understand Latinxs in like the urban South versus the rural South? Thoughts on that? And I think there's on the metaphor of volume of white supremacy, how do you address that volume in creating data to answer questions that address the needs of Black Latinas more, especially in public health, right? I really am gonna retweet that question because I enjoyed Deshira's take on bad data, right? I've been reading The Mathematics of Black Life by Catherine McKittrick. And so the idea of bad data, or like, what do we do with these numbers, is really interesting to me, thinking through numerical like data versus like historical census, because I also work with those. So I'm gonna retweet that question and I'm gonna leave it there, and I'm gonna come back to the questions hopefully in about like at around 5:02. So that I just want everyone to have the eye on the clock. My panelists, you are doing amazing. Deshira, why don't you start?
So that question was, I'm sorry, I need to read it. I'm a visual person. Could you repeat that last question on
bad data?
Or like, well, it was about Afro-Latin.
Yes.
Afro-Latin.
So it was on volume. How are we creating, like, how do you envision creating data that is specific enough to address the question, the needs of Black Latinas, especially in public health? But,
So there are some data sets that exist, but they don't always ask the question about how do people racially identify or the racialized experiences. So like there's data sets from the Northeast that focus on Puerto Rican health. They're the Boston Puerto Rico Health Study. Good data set, but they didn't ask a single thing about race. There's like no racial question. There is one on like skin color, so like some phenotypic things. I'm actually using that in my data for my next study to figure out what components I could use to kind of construct a racialized kind of variable. So thinking about this from like a non-observed or just like not one unique question on race. But the way I would have probably wanted to do it was asking multiple questions about race. The problem is for large data sets, every question you add costs like tens of thousands of dollars. So they only want to ask a couple demographic questions. That's why you probably only get like one question on race. Maybe they'll do like also ethnicity. Sometimes they combine it, which then causes issues again with people who don't identify, who. So like I was talking to a friend of mine who's Mayan, and she's like, it took me a while to understand what this Latino thing was because my family does not speak Spanish. We're Mayan from Guatemala. So we're having a lot of this conversation. So she's like, I actually put in Indigenous or Native American as my race because that is actually accurate. So, so thinking about how to ask that in multiple ways, as I mentioned, a future data set I would like to do is one where I actually try to recruit a significant proportion of the sample as people who would identify or have a lived experience as Black Latinx. So it's not just 11 people out of 1,000 in the data set. So that I can actually think about and produce the data necessary. And then thinking again about what I said about quantitative data and the biases towards that, to think about policy and policy construction and creation. I'm actually working first on qualitative data to showcase, because someone talked about kind of what does it mean to be in the South? I thought it'd be interesting to ask questions about Black Latinx people's lived experiences in North Carolina. There is that qualitative, there's books about that, of course, in different parts of the US. I think this could be complementary, but the reason the Southeast is super interesting is because I think of the Southeast as a very Black space, one that has violence and trauma, but also resistance too. And I want to know what it means to navigate, or for them, if they've migrated from another part of the United States or directly here from another country, or they've been here for multiple generations, what it means to have Blackness, what does it mean in the Southeast, in a space like the Southeast, which then I'll move into on the health side of things. I'm not an anthropologist, but really thinking about that from a qualitative and then a quantitative perspective.
Thank you. So we still have, is it possible for Latinidad to divest from anti-Blackness? Also, the differences between rural and urban Southern Latinx studies. There's also other questions in the chat if you see them. I personally think, just giving my 2 cents, is it possible for Latinidad to divest from anti-Blackness? I actually, I'm interested in this mostly because now I'm hearing more calls for like white Latinidad, critical studies, like critical white studies. And I actually think that's not good because that, me and Cecilia were talking about this before, and that is Latinidad and Latino studies. So is it possible for it to divest? I'm not sure, but I think if it were to divest, it's by forefronting Black and Indigenous Latinxs to the forefront for sure. That's my 2 cents on that.
I would also add, I'll add just a little bit and then mostly just read out some of the people who I think are saying even smarter things about this. I would also agree. I think that I think it is impossible to disentangle the category of Latino from its historical and contemporary investments in white supremacy. And I think unless we like look at that head on and like really face that, I don't think that I think it becomes an even less useful category, right? That I think that we, for example, when we were speaking about this, right, that Latino studies should be critical white Latino, there should be critical white Latino studies should be able to live in Latino studies, right? That the Latino studies is a category that is clearly holding whiteness and therefore should hold its critical white studies of it. I remember Miriam Jimenez Roman, rest in peace, who her sort of original, I remember when I was living in New York, I mean, one of the things she said that sort of blew my mind, right? She was like, Latino is a category that is exclusive, that was created to deny indigeneity and Blackness. And for more on that, I mean, the Afro-Latino reader to me remains the kind of like gold standard of the thinking around this. Other people who I think thinking specifically about Latinos in the US South, Frank Garitti's work, Forging Diaspora, has a whole chapter about Afro-Latinos in Tuskegee. Ginetta Candelario's work, Black Behind the Ears, has a lot about DC. In general, the Black Latinas Know Collective is a place to go find, I think, really exciting work across disciplines. And so I think those are some of the places when we talk about what it would mean, or I mean, not even if what it would mean to think more critically about Latino in that category, those are some of the places I would say would be helpful places for folks interested in this who haven't spent time in this field to read.
I think it's on me, maybe. So I was trying to really get at the question, and I have to move fast, about how do we examine Latinx geographies in relation to Black geographies when we study immigration in the first and second generations in the US South. I think to answer that, we have to, I'm not a historian by training, but I love history. I love to historicize things because I think there's so much that we can learn about what has happened in the past. And I want to say, because my work is about human trafficking, basketball trafficking, and the story that I follow in my ethnography, which is a method that I thought somebody asked about methods, which I think does an amazing job. Not amazing, because it can be critiqued in many ways, but at least ways to help understanding that what Amy Meredith Cox says, missing in the middle, the piece in the lives of Black people, is in this is how anti-Blackness in sport, in basketball, in a place like Texas, where this young person is arriving to a Black person from Panama of West Indian descent, his migration cannot be read outside of larger Black migrations, both by force and ones by choices, and how that impacts the people who bring him here, the non-Black Latino people, the mestizos, the white mestizo people, and how they pull from these migrations of Black people, these ideas of Blackness that have historically influenced how they think about themselves and placing Black people here. And that leads me to mention a couple people who I think are amazing to give you more context on the historical migrations of Black people in the Americas. I'll start with Jarvis McInnes. He's here at Duke. Jarvis McInnes here at Duke. The Black Global South, the Corporate Plantation. Please read that, where he puts the US South in conversation with Central America and the Caribbean in ways that people don't even think about. I mean, I'm a product of that migration, of these Black people meeting each other in these different spaces. I think about it through sport, but he really helps massage this thinking of how these people have been in conversation with each other. It also makes me think about Maya. Oh, I'm skipping on Maya's last name, but Maya is a graduate student at Harvard University, and she has an amazing article in the Southern Quarterly, how she puts her great grandmothers, a Black woman from the West Indies who migrates, or was born in Costa Rica, but Panama, in conversation with the United States imperialistic projects in Latin and Central America, and asks the question, what is the difference between Black people in the United States South sharecropping and these Black people who are not African Americans laboring in these ways very similar to sharecropping in Central America, and how they're in conversation with each other. I think there's enough recommendation. And of course, check out Afro Latinx Travel. I mean, we do a lot of work on our Instagram pages and our Twitter page on pumping out information about centering Black people, histories, and contributions. So I probably went over like a minute or two, but I'm shouting out those people today, and I wish I had some more on my list, but I'll start there.
Right. So pushing this conversation along, right? Sophia, you have a question in the chat. I was fascinated by Sophia's reflections on the layered ways in which culture and music work to construct ideas of what is Appalachian/Southern. Would be curious about the way she seeks to confront and undo that through her own musical performance practice. I'm thinking of the impact that Carolina Chocolate Drops and Our Native Daughters have had, for instance, in changing that conversation about the banjo.
Sure, I can give it a shot. So, I mean, for anyone sort of vaguely interested, there is sort of an emerging scholarship of the African heritage of the banjo and its sort of various lives, although not one that's specifically written from the Black perspective. But they're, speaking into the sort of historical context that foregrounds the history of like Black folks in Appalachia, I would suggest people like Karita Brown or Ankeshi El Amin, or an incredible podcast called Black in Appalachia, which, also makes a lot of gestures towards like non-Black immigrant communities in Appalachia as well, and the sort of emerging communities that are really sort of rapidly shifting the makeup of this region, which unlike the South, right, has not been characterized historically by the Black-white binary. So there's that. And in terms of sort of where I envision the intersection of like Latinx and Appalachian music forms in any related or similar ways, I realized that I didn't fully respond to a prior question, which is like, who are the sort of kinds of musicians or folks that I'm actually working with? And it's sort of twofold. It's Latino folks who are performing Latino music traditions in the Appalachian region, whether or not they're claiming a sort of Appalachian placement or not, right? Considering like Latino music in Appalachia as Appalachian by virtue of its sort of place-based happening. But also I work with a lot of folks who are claiming a sort of fusion agenda and who are working to show like, here's like a traditional bluegrass tune, and like here's a cumbia, and here's what it sounds like when we try to put them together. And the different formations that these take are things like Appalachian, Mexalachian, or Latin grass. And there's a lot of folks, I'm happy to point people to some resources if they want to know more about the sort of really interesting and provocative musical fusions happening. But I think what's important to remember about these things, and in the context of this conversation, right, that we keep returning to, is that it's true in the case of Appalachia in the artistic world, like that creative, like Black creatives in Appalachia have always held space for Latinx creative folks. This is true in the formation of the Afro-Latin poets in the 1990s. And it's true in a lot of the sort of communities of folks that I work with who are working with these traditions. And I'm losing my train of thought. But I mean, it also speaks to the prevalence of like, you know, music's, I mean, I think all popular music in the Western world is like African derived, right? Like I'll make a bold statement, right? Like all like popular music can be traced to like, you know, the Black influences. And so that's a really important part of the story that I'm also trying to tell in thinking about Latinx and Appalachian fusions and how they map onto these like musical paradigms that we have to work with. Yeah.
Oh, not me sending everyone a message when I meant to send it to the panelists, but we're approaching our 5-minute mark, y'all. So if you have ending thoughts, let's hear them, right? One of the things that I'm thinking through, especially from one of the, it's like inspired by one of the questions from the Q&A, kind of talking about how Afro-descendant people fought in Mexico to be counted for the 2020 census, right? That also just happened in Puerto Rico, right? Like people organized on the ground to really explain the census, help people take the census, make sure they're taking it accurately, understanding the work that it does. And now Puerto Rico's not being documented as mostly white, right? And I work with older censuses and censuses, and you see them, people's races are literally changing depending on the year. We don't see of color or color until like the 1930s, right? That's after US occupation. But as far as the US South, I'm thinking about Florida and the large migration post-Maria to Florida and how that is shifting this discourse of the South. And is Florida, I'm from the Midwest, shout out to Chicago, is Florida considered South? So I want us to think about those as we leave, and I leave it to Cecilia for her last remarks.
Well, I will just say, I mean, I don't have any hot takes on what you just said. I think you said it beautifully, so I'm going to let it sit there. I just want to say thank you all for joining us for this panel. I want to thank everyone on the panel. I feel like this was such a really interesting conversation. I really, to me, this feels like the best kind of Latino Heritage Month you can have, one in which you like periodically consider burning Latino to the ground. Like, I just think it's really valuable to like have these conversations collectively and think about across disciplines and the different ways of making knowledge, how we can think about these categories and what they help us with and what they don't help us with. So thank you all for sharing that with me as someone who's in the middle of revising a book. I just feel like I get to benefit from all of your wisdom. So I hope we get to chat more in the future.
And Javier, you have a minute.
I know that's 20 seconds. Thank y'all. No, thank y'all. I appreciate it. It's been good. Yeah, check me out, check us out. Like I love it. Burn it all to the ground. That's how I feel on my everyday about it. I'm trying to take up time for my minute too. But on some real stuff, also to the point that Sarah made about is Miami the South, I think that Deshira can talk about that way more than I can, but I think we also have to like disrupt these notions of what we think the South is. Is it within stereotype? Is it within like the way people talk? Is it the way geography, like trees look, you know, or can it be the same racialized laws, Jim Crow, that were effective in Miami and South Florida, just the way they were in Mississippi, that were just the way they were in Austin, Texas. And I'm not going to talk about my experiences in Miami and how reflective that is on white Cubans, particularly, and other white Latin Americans, and what that looks like in their home countries as well. But thank y'all. Appreciate it. Check me out. Check us out. Love to chop it up. Passing it off.
Sophia, 1 minute.
Sure. Yeah. No, I don't have anything grand to add other than just thank you, and that it's been a real pleasure to learn from all of my new colleagues here. And yeah, I think it's so important to continue to engage in these sort of critical dialogues and not just have them like as a one-off, but like take them seriously and like let them sink in. And to think about what does this criticality also in the context of like, care and how we care for each other and tend to all of the things that we've talked to here today. So thank you all. And thanks, Sarah, especially for doing such a great job moderating.
Am I the last person? Okay, so thank you again. It was wonderful to hear everybody's work and contributions. Again, I think the question of what is the South is really interesting, because when I migrated to the United States, I migrated to Texas and then I migrated to South Florida. Different experiences. And then I moved to North Carolina, very different experience. South, but different forms of South. And so I think that's always super interesting. I also do work I talk a lot about measurement and how we measure things. And that's a lot of the work I do and how we are not measuring things properly. And I did see some questions about people having questions about how do they get at some of these like identities. And so if you want to collaborate or have questions, feel free to email me. You should be able to Google me and find an email address. And I'm happy to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who came out today to participate and to listen to this amazing conversation. Thanks again to Cecilia to getting us all together to have this. Yes.